everybody from every walk of life, it seems like, could have an encounter. So a little bit of comfort hearing that I'm not the only one.
Yeah, you're definitely far from the only one. For every person here on the show, just think about how many people just suffer in silence and you'll never hear about their encounters. So, yeah, you're part of a pretty large fraternity. All right, Mike, please tell us about your encounter. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
All righty. Well, I think it was about 1998, and it was just after Halloween, I believe, near the end of October, beginning of September. And I remember clearly it was a nice brisk day, and it was, I want to say, 6:30 to 7 o'clock in the morning. And I was getting up for school. I lived just outside of Mariposa, California, by a few miles down the 140, headed toward Yosemite National Park. And, you know, it's pretty high up. We got snow during the winter. But this morning there was no snow. It hadn't snowed yet. But it was still that part of the morning where the sun hasn't quite come over the hills. So it's light outside, but there's no sunlight. So it's kind of not dark, but just before the sun comes out. And it was kind of cool. And that morning I set out for the bus. Most mornings I'd be headed to the bus. I'd go with my younger brother, but this morning I believed he had asthma trouble or a doctor's appointment, but for some reason he wasn't with me, probably for the better. So I headed out on I think it was about a half mile down a dirt road to the main road where I caught the school bus. And so about halfway in between that walk was a pond. I'd come off the top of our hill and kind of wind down, and it led out right near this pond, which is, I want to say, roughly about the size of a football field, give or take a few yards. And it was the best pond ever. We had just summers of fun there, fishing and swimming, and never any trouble. And so then as soon as I'd get to the pond, it would be a right turn and then a nice little hill up, and then the rest of that dirt road to the main road. And so this morning I set out and I get down to that pond, and something grabs my attention as I get to the pond and turn toward the main road. And I look across just in time to see, because on around the front side of the pond, on our side of it, it was all flat and pretty even. But the back side had a nice hill that went down into a gully. And I want to say it was about a 20 or 30 foot hill that come from a gully and went up and then come down to the edge of the pond. The other back side of it had a nice little hill or berm on it. And anyway, so as I get down to the pond and look across to where that hill is, I see a very large, hair-covered, I couldn't explain what it is. It was just so massive, and it crept down on all fours toward the edge of the pond. And the one thing I really noticed about it at first was the size of its neck and head. I mean, it was just bigger than any bear I had ever seen. It was bigger than anything. But another thing I noticed was the sheer size and mass of the shoulders, like a linebacker or somebody who worked out, like just odd, you know, like I'm thinking, is this somebody in a suit? Is it a pig or a hog, you know, giant hog? Because another detail I just remembered too is its ears. I remember it had real shaggy fur around the massive neck sitting on these just gigantic shoulders, and two ears that almost looked floppy, you know, like a pig or a hog's ears, but way bigger. And the mane on this, I mean, it had like real shaggy fur right around where the head was. As I'm thinking of it and trying to come up with a sketch, I think I remember seeing its tongue lapping up water, kind of like a dog's. But it had its face down toward the edge of the water. And so I'm sitting there looking at this thing kind of in disbelief, like, what is this? I've never seen anything like this, you know, and I've seen bear, I've seen pig, there's lots of deer, there's even mountain lion, and nothing I could think of was coming up to mind. But the thought that was going through my mind is that my younger brother might be coming down the hill after me. You know, he might be a little late to get into the bus. And so fear ran through me, and I'm thinking, what do I do? Do I go back up and tell him? Do I go? And then also another option I had was near the main road, not too far from the pond, was a stack of rocks, pretty big boulders, and we would climb on them as kids. And so I was thinking, you know, maybe I can get up there. It was about 12 feet off the ground, but a pretty dangerous climb. and thinking, I might be able to hide up there. But for some reason, and it all happened pretty quickly, but for some reason I got this calm that came over me, and just something told me, Mike, you got to move before this thing sees you. And that's what I did. Without hesitation, I moved toward the main road and didn't think twice. I was scared for my brother, but luckily, as the day went on and I came home, he ended up going to the hospital or having a doctor's appointment, so he wasn't on that road alone. But luckily, I think the thing hadn't seen me, so it didn't lift his head, didn't get any clear eyes or mouth front facial features, but I did get the massive head, the big ears. And as I think back too, it kind of comes back to me that it may have been moving an ear, almost like if a deer or a dog hears something and one ear will move. I'm pretty sure that one of the ears might have flicked or moved. And that was about when the thought came to me, if this thing sees you, it could probably make it around that pond in no time and be upon you. But that's about most of the encounter. The past few days I've been working up, talking to you, it's kind of come back and give me a little bit of anxiety.
Oh, I'm sure it hasn't been easy. You said its ears were floppy looking. Have you heard about any other dogman reports that involved a dogman with floppy ears?
I'm not sure. I've listened to a few of them, but I know that that's one thing that kind of stuck out to me, that they were so big. And I think that's why I came back to thinking it might be a boar, because I've seen boars with floppy ears, or pigs with floppy ears. They have almost a canine looking ear, a nice pointy ear, but it can be kind of floppy. And I remember thinking that it might have been a pig because I thought maybe there was like a pig farm or something around there, and I even went and looked. I think afterwards, not that day, but at some point being around it, I kind of looked down the backside of that hill. Because before then, we really didn't go to that side of the pond. I mean, we had been by it, but, it was on the kind of the opposite side of our property. Oh, and then another thing I did remember was there was a house fairly close to the pond, and the lady who lived there, at one point, she came down and was just irate. And this was, I think, after I had my encounter, but my brother and I were there at the pond, and she came down just hysterical, like, you don't need to be in that pond, you need to get away from it, what are you doing? You could get sick. But the way, she was so upset, it kind of seemed like there was another reason she might not have wanted us around that pond or around the property.
Wow, that sure does make you wonder if she did know something about what was going on. How far did you say that home that she lived in was from that pond?
I want to say it was, so there were two hills, like, let's say like the west side and the south side of the pond didn't have any hill on it, but the north side and the east side did, and she lived on the east side, which is a pretty good hill up to where her house was, and her house kind of overlooked the pond. I want to say maybe just 100 yards or so from the pond her house was, but I think she could see it.
So you think she could see it when this was all going on that morning?
Yeah, or I think she could see the pond, to say, not necessarily what I saw, but she might have.
I see. Yeah, she just might have known something if she was that close to the pond.
Another thought I had too was when we first moved up there, it was kind of like living there was one of the like highest points in California, the highest in elevation, that we had lived, and it was pretty good and deep in the woods and lots of wildlife. And going from living in the city or in the valley, with like a city, there's all kinds of noises at night, fire trucks and ambulances and police cars and car alarms and stuff. And you'd think you'd move to the mountains in that deep, that it would be peaceful and quiet. But boy, at nighttime, the hills come alive. The sound that would come out. I think I told you, but another thing that happened there was one night we woke up to all this like really horrible screaming. And it was like, just like things were getting eaten. And even a lady screaming. It was just very strange. And then we find out that lady who had that house that overlooked the pond actually had dogs tied up outside. And while she was gone, she said it was a bear, but who knows, but she came back to find all her dogs eaten and gone, and her chicken coop destroyed and flipped down a hill. And this was the same lady who came up to us and was like, you don't need to be by this pond, and you need to get out of here now.
No wonder she responded that way. Yeah, she definitely knew about it then, I'd say.
That's what I was thinking, because when she came down, it was just like, she was just so upset. And it wasn't, not necessarily to us. It wasn't like a you're trespassing thing. It was like, hey, you're in danger here.
Well, that's admirable of her to look out for you that way. Thank goodness, huh?
Now that I think about it, I was upset as a kid, like trying to run us off our favorite fishing spot. But then I come back to think, oh, and you know what? A thought just came to me too. The funniest thing. So that pond we fished in, right? Scout's honor. I only caught one fish out of it, and it was a nice sized big mouth bass. And on its side, it had a claw mark that went from one end to the other. And I swear up and down, and I can get my brother to contest to that fish that I caught. I thought that, it was a bear that went for it, and maybe that was a scar. A nice scar on the side of this fish. I don't know if I had this picture of the scar on it, but I remember I took the one picture of the one fish I caught at the pond.
Yeah, it sounds like it would have been a trophy since fishing was so hard there. And to find a claw mark even on that bass, sounds like that dog man or whatever that creature was, sounds like it got around.
And that year, too, I remember fires. There were many fires in lots of areas, so I wonder if maybe that might have brought it up or got it out.
Yeah, it might have, but it's hard to say. When you say its ears were floppy, please give us more details on how they looked. Is there a dog breed you could compare them to?
Probably, if any dog breed, I think I might have to go with a German Shepherd. Because I've owned a German Shepherd, and the ears on it were about the same. But the way it flopped and kind of turned at the top, I swear it was like one of them was floppy, or moving or listening, and the other one was pretty straight up and down. But yeah, I would probably say the German Shepherd.
When all this was going on, did you notice a lack of ambient noise?
Yes, yeah, I did. It was deadly silent. It was just quiet. I think it was the reason I could hear myself think and say, hey, you need to get down the road before this thing sees you. And I also always question that because, I was taught growing up in the mountains that if you come across a wild animal, you never run. I mean, if it's a bear, that might be a different circumstances, but usually most times they tell you if it's a mountain lion or something, you act bigger and you stand your ground. But for some reason I had this thought that, hey, you need to get down the road.
Well, you know what they say, Mike, everyone's got a plan until they get hit, or until they see a dog man. Before you had that encounter, had anything ever happened that led you to believe that some unusual creature might have been in that area?
Well, me and my brother had come down one day we were walking to school, same little path, and on the side of the road we come across a deer that was a full-grown doe, and she was pretty good size, with no apparent injuries, but was passed out. And to me, it seemed like exhaustion or shock. Like her eyes were just big, and she was panting just very slowly, like borderline about to die. And we even got a neighbor who had the gun to come down, our mom at the time, talked to him. And he's like, oh no, that thing's dead. Someone probably hit it with a car and then went back home. But it didn't look like it got hit by a car. And I've seen deer on the road that have been hit, and there's blood or there's something you can tell, but there was nothing wrong with her beside her just laying there dead from shock or passed out from shock or exhaustion right on the side of the road. And where she was kind of in a little ditch or a gully that went under the road and fed into the pond, because I think it was a snow runoff pond, if I remember correctly. We did have a nice game trail down at the edge of our property that every morning a herd of deer would come through. I mean, you could hear them and see them through the trees. It was pretty neat. But so I know that, there was deer in the area, and there was a nice game trail that was used daily.
Well, that only makes sense. Wherever you find dogmen, normally you will find a pretty healthy population of deer. Even though it's been 20 years since you had that encounter, do you still think about it a lot?
Yeah, I do think about it from time to time. I know since hearing your show, I've kind of, I never really put anything to it. I just figured maybe it was a mutant. I don't know. I never had an explanation for it. And then listening to your show, it's kind of come back to me and I remembered it. But yeah, over the years, it's come up a couple times because since then I've become pretty interested in cryptids and Bigfoot and things that go bump in the night, and been kind of curious and, always wanting to find out and know more when I hear something like that. And another thing I do is when I meet someone new, I'll ask them, it's kind of funny, but I'll ask them, do you have any ghost stories or do you have any UFO stories or how about Bigfoot? Most people laugh at me, ha ha ha. I've never had a Bigfoot encounter. I've had, other paranormal encounters, never any UFO or alien, but I'm a believer of people. And that's one reason I like your show is because, I believe people on the personal level. And when they're giving an eyewitness account and you can hear in their voice the sincerity, the fear, that's what I think my attraction to the whole cryptid thing is that there's some pretty believable stories out there. And you can hear how shaken people are. One story that really got me into cryptids and stuff was from a guy who was a mentor of mine, and he actually was my employer for a long time and a very honest man. I never had a bad dealing with him. I've never known him to lie or tell anything, but he told me a story that he was told by, the story he heard was from a mutual friend from another friend. He wasn't surprised at that because this guy who actually had the story happen to him was so honest that he wouldn't tell anybody. But one of his really close friends, on a night of drinking, he let loose with it because, again, like these stories, you can't really tell anybody. They think you're crazy. But the story's pretty short. He was on a trail clearing crew in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I think it was like the 60s or 70s, and they had to actually hike up to where their camp was, and they were camped in front of they said it was about a 6-foot boulder, and a Sasquatch come over the top of it and screamed at him, and somebody had a pistol and shot it in the air. It didn't care. It finished screaming, turned around, and left. And they said they packed up that night and got off the hill. It's kind of fuzzy on it, but he told me that, and he said the guy who it was about was a very honest man, that he would not lie. So that's kind of where I got my start. And after hearing that, I'm like, well, that's pretty neat, and I believe this guy, and if he's telling me, I find a little truth in that. And so that kind of started me on my quest to find truth and ask people, because like I said, I believe people.
Well, I'm sure that left the impression on that guy, understandably so, too. Did you feel guilt about not sharing what happened to you with your brother because of the danger it might have put him in?
Yeah, I think I did feel a little guilt, but at the same time, I think maybe the guilt came later, because at first it was more like putting it in the back of my mind and filing it, way back so I never have to think about it or deal with it again. And not to scare people, because I'm sure it would have got a couple people in an uproar, thinking that there's some giant beast out there waiting for us.
Oh, I'm sure it would have gotten more than a couple of people in an uproar. How big did it seem to be?
Well, gauging it, from that side of the pond, I want to say that if it were to stand up on its hind feet, it'd be peaking 12, 13 feet, maybe more, because the size of its head, again, its shoulders and its head and just the neck part, like, it looked like it had something on its shoulders. The head was so big. And I was just thinking, like, what, this just doesn't add up. Something with, it kind of almost has the hair and the fur of a bear, but is on all fours like a cow or a boar or something, but it's got the head of just something else, and ears like a dog or a pig, and just sitting there lapping up water. And the way I remember distinctly the way it creeped down from the hill to the water. And that was very eerie. It all four kind of crawling low to the ground. But yeah, still brings me shivers and chills when I think about it.
Well, I think it would give anyone shivers to think about an experience like that. If you think it would have been that tall on 2 legs, how tall was it down on all 4s?
On all 4s, it was at least clearing about 5 feet or plus, like with its shoulders when it was I mean, it did get pretty low at times, but I could tell, when it got down to the water's edge and it kind of was in that push-up position, it was pretty good size. I mean, the neck and the shoulders on this thing, I mean, it was bigger than any bear I had seen ever. I mean, at least up there, in California.
Yeah, that is awfully big. I know you said it was down in that crouching position, so it might have been hard to notice details in its leg structure, but I still need to ask to be thorough anyway. Did you have the ability to see what type of leg structure it had, hominid versus canine style?
It looked more hominid for the arms and the legs. I couldn't really see the hind legs too well, but just the sheer size of its kind of back, because it was I think I kind of had just a slight side profile, like it wasn't straight directly, at the pond. It was kind of to the side drinking at a little, I think there was a couple little kind of calm spots on the side, or just like a little kind of alcove deal on that side of the pond where it turned. So he might have been out on like a bar, a sandbar, a little mud bar drinking kind of at an angle. So I was able to kind of see his shoulders, his kind of side a bit, but remembering the back hind legs, it was kind of fuzzy. But again, it all happened real quick and the adrenaline was pumping and it was it was intense.
Oh, I'm sure it was. You talked about how the ears were floppy, but you didn't mention where they were positioned on its head. Where were they positioned?
Pretty high, like the back pretty high. So, and that's what was surprising to me because it had this just massive bodybuilder shoulders. And then this head, it was like that's why I'm saying 13 feet, because it looked like 3 feet, the neck and the head, like it was just so massive. But then it had like kind of a longer face going into the water, drinking, and the ears were kind of at the very top of that coming off.
When you say it had a longer face, do you mean it had a muzzle?
Kind of like a muzzle, I couldn't, on the face part, I couldn't make out much detail besides seeing the tongue a couple times, which as I thought back to it and trying to come up with a sketch for you, I come up with thinking about that I saw the tongue, and I didn't get much detail on the muzzle, if it had a muzzle, but it did have a very long face from where like the forehead would be down to the mouth. It was quite big. I mean, it was just huge. I just couldn't wrap my head around how big it was.
Well, no one can fault you for not noticing whether it definitely had a muzzle or not. I mean, you definitely had more important things on your mind, most notably not having a Charmin moment.
Yeah, and not being lunch for this thing or breakfast.
Oh, yeah, I'd say. Not good. How much trouble did you have after having that encounter, doing the things you needed to do in day-to-day life?
Not too much trouble, but again, doing anything around that pond or the backside of that pond, I pretty much didn't do any more fishing on the other side of that pond, especially not alone. I didn't even like going down there. I had another thought that came up to me too, is that we had a pit bull, a lab, and a German shepherd at that property. Every morning almost they'd run down, most mornings at least, they would run down and get in that pond. And so I'm kind of curious, has there been any encounters where like dogs are friendly with the dog man or aren't bothered by it, I wonder? Because they seem to be pretty comfortable around that pond.
Well, there have been instances where dogs didn't seem to really react to a dogman's presence, but I don't know of any situations where a dogman's been around and dogs seem to like it. Most of the time when people talk about a dogman being present when dogs are too, the dogs aren't happy. They're either apoplectic or they're terrified.
Yeah, because one of the dogs was pretty terrified. Like she had a real problem with, she was just, a very fearful dog and very submissive. And I think she might have been abused. I'm not sure on that, but we had never put our hands on her. We loved her to no end, but she still was very skittish around the property and when people would come up on her.
Were there any other strange experiences on that piece of land?
There was another lady who lived kind of on the other side of the property, more near the main road, but she had livestock, I think goats and sheep and stuff, and maybe chickens. And she had multiple encounters with, I think, bears trying to get in, but she also had where her animals were killed. She had lost goats and chickens. and I think just kind of chalked it up or, explained it with it being a bear, which in that area, I don't know if I believe that.
Yeah, it's funny how bears seem to take the blame for these dogman encounters all too often. Before you go, Mike, do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
No, I think that's about it. I appreciate you letting me come on and share my story, and, if it helps anybody out, I'll be grateful. And I appreciate you doing the show, Vic. You're doing a great job, and we all love listening to you.
Well, thanks so much for your time coming on the show, and thanks for the good words. I appreciate it. Tonight's second guest is Aki. Aki, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Vic, for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. Aki, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, okay. My name is Aki. I'm from the Syracuse area. I've been cooking for a restaurant. I have a family, and I do stories for a passion.
When you were small, did your mom tell you that monsters weren't real, even though she had had a dogman encounter of her own before you were born?
My mother never told me that monsters didn't exist. If anything, she told me the opposite. My mom always told me that there's things out there that we can't explain. I'm sure her incident impacted those thoughts.
Well, I'm glad she was honest with you about that. How did that impact you when you're hearing your mom telling you that monsters actually were real?
I believed her. And then it wasn't too long after I had my incidents and seen things in the city that tell me that this world is very strange.
Yeah, it sure is. There's no denying that. From what you've told me in the pre-interview, your mom's been telling you about that encounter she had almost your whole life. How old were you when she started telling you about that?
When she first told me her story, I was 8 years old, and she had sat me and some friends that were staying the night over. We were watching movies or whatever at the time. And she sat me and my friend down, and she explained what happened to her and her friend.
When she's sitting there telling you about this story without telling us any of the details of her encounter, what are you thinking? I mean, after all, this is your mom telling you this story.
Like I said in the previous interview, I took it as just a story that had happened to her. I was really young, so I didn't really know what to think of it. But 4 years later, after I had my experience, I looked at the whole situation differently. And when she told me her incident, I could see that it had affected her. She can't sleep in a house by herself. She can't go into the woods. She's petrified of the woods. But for some reason, she's fascinated with dogmen and werewolves. And I think she was so afraid that she became fascinated with it.
Well, that would make sense. Whenever you're terrified of something like that, it is human nature to try and find out as much about that subject as you can. So I'm glad she's doing that. In a way, I'm sure it's helping her to deal with that experience.
I think that's a way that she copes with it, is watching the movies that she watched and just talking about it when the time happened.
Since you said she's so into the dogman topic, is your mom how you found out about my show, or did you find out about it on your own?
Oh, I found out about your show on my own, Vic. One night I was just going through YouTube. I seen your YouTube channel and I clicked onto it, and it gripped me. And I told my mom, I said, Mom, you got to listen to these interviews. A lot of these people has had a similar situation to you. So she listened and she became fascinated with your show herself. And she just wants me to tell you thank you for doing what you do and that you saved her mentally by listening to these interviews. So I just want to thank you for that, Vic.
You're welcome, and please make sure she knows that she's welcome too. If at any time she'd like to talk about that experience she had, of course she doesn't have to come on the show. If she wants to come on as a guest and tell us about that experience, that's fine. We can definitely set that up, but I'm more than happy to talk with her about that experience and help her any way that I can.
We appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. What can you tell us about the place where your mom's encounter happened, Aki?
Okay, so the place that this happened at is in the Syracuse area. It's towards the east side, and that's a big variety of where it could be at. I don't want to give the specific location. But this place used to be somewhat of a morgue before it turned into the building for just swimming. And how it's built is it's like a camp area, the best way I can explain it, and it has housing units around a halfway circle street. From the side of this, there's a building in the back where the women lived. And then on the side of the building, there's a hill where the park was, and this is where the incident happened.
Let's go ahead and talk about that experience now. Please give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Okay, So this is what's been told to me pretty much all my life. It was the year of 1987. My mom and her friend, we'll call her Sam, had been living in this building just for women. They were in her room, and it was around 9:30 at night, and it had been in the fall month, and I believe it was a couple weeks before Halloween, actually. So my mom's friend asked her if she wanted to go to the park because they didn't want to go out that night. It was like a Friday night. The doors were going to lock soon. So they just decided to go to this park. So my mom had agreed. So the two of them proceeded to go to the park. They walked up the hill, and how this park looks is basically it has swing sets, it has a little play area. Then there's a ladder that goes up to a patio that you can stand over and look over the area, and it's connected to a slide. So this is where they were hanging out at. They were sitting there and they were talking, and then just out of nowhere, my mom explained to me that she heard a horrible howling growl coming from the forest area outside the field where the park was. So the two of them looked at each other and they asked each other if they heard it, and they agreed. Within a few moments, again, it repeated itself, but this time it was closer. So this time they became really, really afraid. They became statues is how my mom explained it. They just felt like there was something around them and they could not leave. They did not want to move. So another few moments later, they heard it again, but this time they had heard it underneath the area that they were sitting. And it had scared my mom's friend so bad that she had urinated herself. What she explained to me is that she could see the wet outlining of the pants and it going down her legs. So my mom tried to coach her friend that, we have to get out of here. There's something around us. We need to get back to the building. And her friend became unresponsive. So knowing that my mom, who she is, she's like, I have to get out of this situation. So she took it upon herself to get up. And she began to climb down the bars. And as she was climbing down the bars, this is what she told me, Vic, she seen in front of her, underneath the patio area in the space, two, not red eyes, not green eyes, but two yellow eyes looking at her. And it scared her so bad that she let go of the bar. She dropped down to the ground. She was screaming for her friend that she needed to get out of there. So she got up on her feet and she proceeded to run. And the story goes that she got about 40 feet away and she looked behind her. So she seen her friend running now. So her friend must have snapped out of the shock position that she was in and proceeded to run along with my mom. And my mom said when she looked back and she was 40 feet up ahead, she seen the creature just standing behind her friend as her friend was running, just letting them get a head start. And then it made a gesture as if it was going to chase them. So she didn't continue to look back anymore. What she wanted to do was she wanted to keep running, and she didn't go to the main entrance because she figured by then the building had been locked. So the girls knew that the back door would always be open because they would sneak people in, they would sneak people out, they did whatever they did at that time. So they pretty much just knew that the basement door would be open. So my mom proceeded to run. At the angle that she was running, she seen that the door was crept open, and she made it inside. Meanwhile, her friend is still running out in the field, and she could hear her friend screaming, it's going to get me, it's going to get me. So finally, it must have took forever. Her friend had arrived. She got her friend inside the building. They shut the door. They locked it. She explained to me that they sat, they cried together. Eventually, they had to separate, and my mom did tell me that night she did hear a howl. They never told anybody around the area, and when I got older, I was the first one she ever told. And that's pretty much how that story goes.
How descriptive did your mom get describing what she saw that night?
She told me that she couldn't lie and make up facts. This is what she's seen. She's seen two yellow eyes staring at her, and she's seen a brown type of furry outline standing. It was standing on 2 feet. She wanted to make that clear, that it was standing on 2 feet. She didn't say anything about how the leg shapes were. I know a lot of people report that the legs look funny, but she didn't give me any type of description like that.
I can only imagine what they must have gone through back then. At its closest, I'm a little fuzzy on how close it got to your mom's friend. It sounds like it got closer to your mom's friend than it ever got to her.
Well, I believe she's the one that suffered from it from the most. My mom says she wasn't right after that. And I did get to meet this woman, and she did confirm that this happened. Yeah, they've suffered from it for years. My mom still talks about it to this day.
Oh, I'm sure she does. I'm sure she thinks about it all the time, unfortunately. But going through something like that, it will tend to have that sort of effect on you. You said your mom is still suffering through after effects from that encounter, but do you know if nightmares are one of the after effects?
Oh, she definitely has nightmares. Like I said, she can't go into the woods. She's petrified of the woods. She can't be in houses by herself. She's not a person who likes to be alone.
Well, that's understandable, like I said, after an experience like that. When your mom saw those yellow eyes as she was climbing down, do you know how close the dogman was to her at that point?
Oh, it must have been only a few feet away from her. And the reason why I say that, Vic, is because I've actually played on this playground. I've actually been to this area and seen this area for myself. I would be lying if I said I didn't live 10 minutes away from it. I try to remain away from there because of the stories that I've heard, but I've seen the park myself.
Right now, are there a lot of woods around that park, or is it all built up around it?
Oh, it's still the same. It's very, very dark at night. You would think that it wouldn't be, being that it's in a city, but that doesn't mean anything. Once it gets to be around 3, 4 o'clock around here, it's very dark here in Syracuse. If I may, Vic, I just want to mention that there is an Indian reservation around here. It's pretty big. It's around Syracuse, outlining. And I've been there, and it's terrifying there. They stay in their area, and Syracuse stays in their area. And the only reason why people go to the reservation is to get cigarettes.
How close is that res?
Oh, it's 5 minutes south side of Syracuse. If that, it's really connected if you want to know.
Well, that is close. Does your mom realize that dog man let her and her friend get away that night?
I think she does after she has listened to your episodes. I think she was confused how they got away. If it wanted to get them, it really could have got them. But obviously it let them escape. And I think she realizes how lucky she was to escape. These things are real, Vic. You know, people say they want to go out and they want to find these things, and some people think it's a joke, but it's not. When you physically see this thing or you physically hear this thing, it's real.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're definitely real, and the experiences, too. Did you notice any changes in the way your mom would deliver that story over the years, possibly indicating that as time went by, she was actually having an easier time talking about that experience?
Her story never really changed. Maybe like little things when she would talk about it, but that's what made it real to me, is that her story never changed the whole time that she's been telling me this her whole life. My whole life. She's always been the same. She can't be alone.
Well, I hope things have gotten at least a little easier for her as she's related that story more and more times. That's normally how it is, but I guess there is no guarantee that's how it's always going to be.
I believe, Vic, once you have a dogman encounter, you never fully recover. You never look at life the same again. You never look at the woods the same again. Your life has completely changed in a way.
No, I agree. I definitely agree. Life never will be the same once you have an experience like that, but it is possible to eventually get to the point where you can function the way you need to function and do the things you need to do in a healthy way. You had a strange experience of your own from what I understand. What happened to you?
So this is how my story goes. When I was 14, I was with my friend, and we were on our way to his girlfriend's birthday party. And this happened in a trailer park area, because I used to live in a trailer park when I was a kid. And there was a lot of forestry and a lot of water and lake around there. So we proceeded to go around, I don't know, I say around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. We decided to leave outside the trailer park and cut behind this plaza area. So as we were walking, to the right of us was the forest. And just as we got halfway, we heard the howl. And it scared us. We stopped dead in our tracks. And we asked each other, hey, did you hear that? And we said, yeah, we heard that. So we took off running. And by the time that we made it to the public area, we had heard a scream, like a woman screaming from the woods. And I never understood that until I got to listen to your show and realized that that's what they do. And that's how I know it was a dog man. I don't understand why a woman would be in the middle of the woods screaming along with a howl. It just doesn't make sense to me. I know that was a dog man.
How close did the source of that sound seem to be from you?
I would say maybe about 60 feet away. Yeah, it definitely had us in its eyesight. I'll say that.
Yeah, that's close.
Later that night, I had to walk home by myself, and I had lived in a trailer park in the back, so I had to walk all that distance going home, and I had never been so afraid, Vic, in my life. Walking, knowing that I had heard that thing, and knowing that nobody was around. If, like, something wanted to get me at that time, there was nothing I could have done. I was only a 14-year-old kid. I mean, even now as a grown man, there would be nothing I could do.
From what you told me another time, you and your girlfriend found something in a field. What did you find?
Well, that was from a previous girlfriend. We used to stay with her parents out in a country field, and one day we were on our way to a friend's house, and when we were arriving back, we would cut through this field, and in the middle of the field was only one footprint, and it was huge. It was like a bear footprint. And I never understood why there was only one. If I would have had a camera phone at the time, I would have. But by then, phones were just getting popular for cameras.
Yeah, back then I guess you didn't have the ability to take a cast of that print, did you?
Oh, I didn't, Vic. Not at the time. I remember it, though. I do.
I'll bet you do. Well, it's about time for us to get out of here, Key. Before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
I just want to say, from us down in the audience, that we appreciate what you do, Vic. We look forward to your episodes. I just want to say thank you for having me come on this show. I just want to thank my mom for letting me tell her story to you. It's not a joke. These things are real. Whether if it's spiritual or if they're an animal, it doesn't matter. The point is, you could be driving down the street one night, see one of these things come by you and change your whole perception on how life is. And that's just the reality of it, whether if you want to believe it or not.
Well, thanks again so much for your time, Aki. Have a great night.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's guest Dave was our guest for episode 107 titled Den of Horrors. Since that show aired, he's had more interesting experiences. Dave, thanks so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me on the show again, Vic.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Dave, for those listeners who haven't heard any of the shows you've done, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
I'm 26 years old. I live in Brazier Falls. Pretty much your average hunter. I'm not 100% gung-ho. I don't go out all the time. I still like to be out in the woods. Currently, right now, just working. I work on the res. And, of course, like to go out, play airsoft during the summer when the season's nice. And, of course, during hunting season, I'll go out, hunt whitetail, go hunt rough grouse. I play video games once in a while. Used to do it quite a bit when I was a kid. Didn't really get very much time to do it when I was living with my father. Most of the time it was work, but that's understandable. And, of course, I'd never had a dogman encounter up until recently. It'd be last year. Like the very end of last year. I actually did not know about dogmen for probably at least a good 10 years. It wasn't until I recently saw your show. I read a couple books on them. But other than that, I'm a believer now.
You're a knower now.
Definitely. I never thought I would see one. I listened to the show. I never thought it was possible. I mean, I know that it's kind of a rarity when people see them, but I guess I kind of cheated myself out of that one. I got a little bit of a wake-up call that last weekend of hunting season.
Yeah, you did. For those listeners who haven't listened to episode 107, please tell us about the den experience you and your friend had that day.
Well, the day that we found that, there's a company called Ducks Unlimited, and they went out back of my grandmother's property on the reservation, and they did a little, basically like a landscaping job. They basically tore apart the swamp, and they put little ponds in for the ducks and the geese, and they basically rerouted the water that was going through there, and they made a little creek. The creek was probably 15 feet wide, maybe 20 feet wide. My friend and I went back there with the four-wheeler and a bunch of old lumber that nobody wanted to use, and we wanted to build a bridge across it. So we built this little bridge across this creek, and on the other side of the creek was what we thought was a beaver house. And this beaver house that we found had a little hole dug out on the side. Basically, if people want to know like the best description of it, the way it was built, because it was definitely added to something, whatever was living in it added to the structure itself, because it was a lot bigger than your typical beaver house. If you watch the Paranormal Witness episode, The Pack, where that pack of dogmen is stalking that family that lives in that house there, when their daughter finds, like, she called it a nest out back, and they had that hole dug out on the side. That's basically what it looked like, just scaled up on a much larger scale. My friend actually went into it, and he had a flashlight with him. And he went in and looked inside. I never went in because I was too scared to go in. But he basically had found skeletal remains in there of multiple animals. There were deer skulls in there. There were cow skulls. Pretty much all the leg and arm bones of different animals. When he told me what he saw, he also mentioned that some of the bones that were in there looked like human remains. Now, he didn't see a human skull or anything, but he did see ribs. There's a couple rib cages that looked exactly like a human's. And the other scary thing was he found human clothing in there. They were definitely old, but one of them had a claw mark in it, from what he told me. It was a purple jacket. And he also found, I think, some pants and that are laying on the ground, but whatever was in there had made a nest, like in the corner of the hut. And it had fur all over. He said it smelled god-awful. And there were different chambers in it. The only chambers he saw was the first chamber he went into. There was a second one in the back, and then there was a third hole that went deeper into the ground. But he never went down there because it was so dark. But he basically just found all the bones in there of different animals, possibly a human. He didn't know. He thought, anything's possible back there. But he couldn't exactly identify it. We weren't necessarily well-tuned in identifying bones. I mean, I knew what deer bones and that looked like, and he did too. And cow bones, because they were so large. But he found that stuff in there, and he checked out the other chamber, and basically when he was walking out, or not really walking, but crawling out, because he had to crawl through there, he said that something was down in the third chamber. He could hear it. He didn't see it. He put his flashlight down there. He didn't see anything. But he got out of there, and then we basically got out of the area where the hut was, got across the bridge, got on the four-wheeler, and we just got this really eerie feeling. We took off, and we never came back there.
I'm glad you didn't. Do you know if that den's still there?
Surprisingly, my uncle actually did get a drone, and he flew it back there. He didn't get really close. He was just doing a surveying job, seeing if he could map out all of our property. And we had a flood back there. It was a couple years ago. We had tons of snow, and it just melted off in literally a period of a couple days because it warmed up. And I guess the creek must have gotten so much water in it that it just completely flooded out the entire area where the ponds were. And it took the hut with it because he said there wasn't anything there. The trees were all knocked down too.
Huh, yeah, I wondered about that. It might seem crazy to think you'd ever wish you'd gone inside that den with your friend that day so you'd know what it really looked like inside, but did you ever regret not going in with him?
Something in the back of my mind was telling me not to go in there. He was obviously a lot more brave than I was. I mean, I was still creeped out when I was outside of the den because I was all by myself, and the wood line is literally right where we were. So, I mean, being as dark as the woods were, I was freaked out because I wanted him to come back out. But another part of me was saying it would be interesting to see what was in there, especially when he said all those bones were in there. I mean, usually when somebody tells me there's remains in there, I mean, it's going to scare me, and I'm not going to want to go in there because there's just that fear of what might be living in there.
A lot of people last time around were wondering why you didn't contact the authorities and let them know about that.
I don't think the authorities would really do anything about it. I mean, tribal police, really the only ones that have jurisdiction there. I mean, FBI could technically go back there, but we couldn't really verify that there were human remains. He said they just looked like them. So we didn't want to take the chances of telling my aunt or my grandmother and oh, we found human body parts back there. And then them basically going nuts, calling the tribal police and whatnot. And then they all of a sudden send an investigation team back there. Or they contact some other sources outside of the reservation. They start this huge investigation only to find bones that aren't human. And they probably get a little bit upset with us. So we were kind of 50-50 about doing it, but we thought, there's no point in trying to do it when we might actually end up getting in trouble for it.
On episode 107, you also told us about an encounter with a dogman your mom had. Please tell us about what happened to her.
That was what was supposed to be a Sasquatch encounter, what she said. But when she described it to me and gave me the details on what the thing looked like, it most definitely couldn't have been a Bigfoot because she described it as having a snout and the ears and basically the claws. But when she saw this thing, it was further up from the den. I mean, this was probably half a mile away from the den, closer to my grandmother's house. But she had a horse named Dancer, and she went horseback riding. And she just barely got out back. She was on the horse for maybe 5 minutes. And her horse went nuts. And when the horse went nuts, she caught a glimpse of this thing sitting over in the tree line with its hand in a hemlock tree. And it was watching her. And of course, when she saw it, she just got a very, very brief description of the creature. And she said, well, it had its hand up on a branch, and she saw it was staring at him. And then she described the facial features, the snout, the canines, the ears, and the hair. She said it was completely black. And she said this thing had claws on it, and it looked just like bear claws on its fingers. But she said the hands were just like humanoid, but also like a raccoon's almost. Just like most dogman hands are described in most episodes, it looked just like a raccoon's hand. And the horse bolted on her. She almost fell off, so she was contemplating whether or not she was going to get eaten or not, if she was going to fall off. But she held on for dear life. And then Dancer took off like a bat out of he didn't go back there ever since.
How long before you were born did you say that happened?
She was just a kid, so, I mean, this was going to be probably a good 20, maybe 30 years before I was born.
Okay, I see. You believe your first dogman experience might have happened when you were muzzle litter hunting one day when you were a kid. What happened that day?
Well, that day, my father had me carrying, it was an old Kentucky rifle. It was just a .45 caliber with a percussion cap. And he had to go help my uncle because he literally just shot at a buck that night, and it was just starting to get dark. So I didn't have a ride back with my father. He had the four-wheeler. So I was on my own. I had to walk back, and the distance back to the camp is a little over 3/4 of a mile. And it was starting to get dark, and of course, me being me as a kid, I watched too many monster movies, so I said, I'm not walking back in the dark. But I didn't get up and leave fast enough, and I got up. The sun was pretty much coming out of the sky pretty quickly. I mean, it was during the fall, so it gets dark really quick. So I started hoofing it back to the camp. And of course, I got into the wood line, and there's a small patch of hemlocks there. And of course, it's really dark in there. So I kind of got this eerie feeling that something was watching me. And I shrugged it off, and it's like, it's probably a deer. So I walked down the road, kept walking, and I got into the hardwoods. And the hardwoods aren't really all that bad. They're pretty bright even when it's dark out, because the leaves weren't on. So I finally got to our hemlock stand. And this is on what we call the camp lot, because it's literally right behind our camp. And it just turns pitch black. You get off the road into the hemlocks just as you walk in, and it's literally like someone just shut the lights off in your room with no window available. It's just absolutely dark in there. And of course, got into the woods, and I made maybe a 1 minute walk into the forest, just barely getting into the woods. And it was probably only about 50 yards that I got in because I wasn't walking very fast. And this feeling of dread just came over me, and I just got this eerie feeling that I was being watched. So I looked around, and of course, everywhere you look, it's dark, and you'll just see shadows everywhere. So I decided, my mind's telling me to run, so I'm going to run. So I took off, and I bolted. I mean, I was running for my life. But as I was running, I could distinctly hear the sound of footsteps behind me. Something was running behind me. But I never turned around to look. I didn't dare do it. I mean, I was a kid. I had seen enough monster movies to know I'm not going to look behind me to see what's chasing me. So I ran and I ran and I ran, and I could literally see where the woods opened up into a little bit of hardwoods and then opened up into the driveway where the camp is. And it was just my light at the end of the tunnel, and I had to get there. And I just ran as fast as my little legs could take me, because I know I have a rifle on my hands, but it's got one shot. It's a muzzleloader, and it's only a 45 cal. I'm pretty sure if shooting a monster with it is just gonna piss it off. So of course I bolted, and finally I got to the end of the wood line, got into the parking lot or the camp, and of course I turned around, and I could just distinctly see a shadowy figure standing in the trees where the hemlocks were. And I couldn't see what it was, so I didn't know what it was. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I sat there and watched, and I looked away for a second and looked back, and it was gone. So I walked back up to the camp, and I sat inside the camp and waited for Dad, basically scared to death. I stayed away from the windows. I just sat down in the chair in the back of the camp where there was no windows and waited for Dad to get there. Absolutely terrified out of my mind.
I'll bet that was the longest wait of your life.
It was terrifying, because he literally didn't get back for probably an hour, so I had to sit inside the camp in the dark by myself. I was literally gripping that gun with a death grip.
Did you ever wind up telling your dad or your mom about that experience?
That was the only time I actually told my dad that I thought something happened, and I was only met with ridicule. He said that nothing chased you. You're watching too many monster movies. So there's nothing back there. You're running at shadows. And basically told me that, I need to stop goofing off. I need to stop watching horror movies. So he didn't believe anything was back there because he doesn't believe in cryptids. So of course I thought, well, maybe if I tell my mom. So I told my mom about it. And she pretty much said the same thing. She didn't believe me. Sometimes she would nod and say, oh yeah. It's just how she talks to kids. So I was like, nobody believed me. So I kept it to myself from then on after that.
At that point, had your mom shared that experience with the dogman with you, or is that something that she didn't tell you about until later on in life?
She didn't tell me about that until later on, because I really didn't know anything about Bigfoot or Dogman. And it wasn't until my uncle got me started about that he mentioned something with my mom. And then I thought about it. And then finally one day I was bored. We were sitting in the car one day, and I just told her about the experience, and it's like, oh, my uncle said you had an experience with a Bigfoot. And she's like, yeah, I guess it was a Bigfoot. And she started telling me about it, and it was kind of weird the way she described it. It's like, I didn't think Bigfoot had ears on top of their head or a snout. And then it was the few years after that I finally heard about Dogman. And then all those years before I finally saw your show, which was quite a ways up the road. It wasn't until well after high school. And I finally knew about Dogman, and of course, that was a big shocker for me, because I was like, holy, people actually see things that look like a werewolf. Werewolves were the one thing as a kid that scared the absolute out of me. I mean, I had nightmares about them. I was terrified of the woods. But people always said, oh, they're not real. So I finally started to get that idea, well, they're not real, so I mean, what's to be scared of? And then my uncle starts telling me about Dogman and that, and it's like, are you serious? People are seeing this? And I started listening to your episodes, and my God, it just sent chills up my spine.
Considering how she had that Dogman encounter long before you're even born, that day when she responded the way she did to the news you gave her, did that surprise you at all?
It did, because, I mean, I think the reason why she responded the way she did is because I was a kid. She probably didn't want to scare me. Because I know how she was, and when I lived with her, we were usually living out in the woods, and she knew my views of the woods, because I didn't really hunt much when I was a kid. I didn't like the woods during the day or during the night. I was just absolutely terrified of it. So I think she was just doing her best to keep me from being scared. But nowadays, I mean, when I ask her about it, she's more open about it, because she knows, obviously, nothing's going to scare me.
On one hand, I can understand why a parent would respond that way, but if there wasn't a threat, I think it would make a lot more sense. Since she had seen a dog man when she was young herself with her own 2 eyes, I just don't understand how she could try and tell you that a threat's not out there when she knows as a fact that the threat is there.
Yeah, it's kind of weird why people do that, but I guess it's just for the best interest of their kids.
Well, I guess you could look at it that way, but if the threat's out there, then maybe it's not in their best interest. I guess it just depends on the kid, though, and the situation. After having that experience at such a young age, how long was it before you were able to go back into the woods?
At that age, I didn't really have a choice, because when I was with my dad, he didn't care. He was always making me go out in the woods with him, but I was usually right there by him. So I had to go out whether I liked it or not, but I tried my best just to get back before dark. I just tried to keep it secret from my dad. He wanted me to sit till dark, because you're supposed to anyway, because you could literally be sitting there, and I've had it happen before. Bucks will literally come out just before it gets dark. Even still today, I like to get out before it gets too dark. If there's a buck out, I'll give him a chance to live. I mean, if he comes out earlier, depending on his size, he might get blasted, because the venison needs to be in the freezer at one point. But either way, before dark, if it's just one of those days where I get this feeling where back of my mind says, you need to get out of here and get back to the camp before it gets too dark, then I'll do that. I mean, other days I'll feel safe, and then I'll leave when it gets dark. But other than that, being out in the woods when I was a kid, it was mostly forced than anything. I had no choice. So that's what kind of sucked about it. Nowadays, I just go whenever I want.
Yeah, it is a shame he made you go back into the woods like that the way he did, but like you said, you didn't have a choice.
Yeah, work to be done, and he just was trying to teach me, I guess. I mean, he was trying to bring me up right, but I mean, when you're scared half to death most of the time, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I'd say. You came on this week's episode of Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio and told us about a more recent experience you had where you think a huge Sasquatch just might have protected you from a dog man. For the listeners who missed that show, please tell us the story behind that.
Well, the story behind that was, it was the final weekend of hunting season. It was this past December. It was muzzleloading weekend. And I went out and I did some still hunting over on my grandfather's property. It was bordering what we call the Wooden Gate property. And the Wooden Gate is the sanctuary that we have for the deer that we don't hunt. It's basically so the deer feel safe. Nobody's allowed to go on it. Somebody can go and still hunt on it if they want, but you have to tread lightly, as my dad says. But I was bordering that property, and basically that whole entire area is just littered with hemlocks and pine trees. There's some hardwoods in it. It's mostly hemlocks, so it's really dark in there. But this particular day, for the entire day, it was about 9 o'clock when I started seeing the Sasquatch, but I'd only see him once in a while. I didn't start seeing him more heavily until about noon that day when I stopped for lunch. And he followed me the entire day, and by the end of the day when it was starting to get dark is when he switched to the opposite side of me. He was over on my left side. I was walking towards the camp, and the Wooden Gate property was on my left. And I was really close to the hemlock forest. The hemlock forest was only probably a little over 100 yards away from me. But between me and the forest was a lot of berry briars and bushes, so you couldn't really see anything. My right side was pretty much clear. You could see everything up there other than the ridge that this Bigfoot was walking down. That's how he was basically staying out of my sight. And during the day, he followed me all the way down to the end of the property, and I got turned around, so I had to basically find my way out using the GPS on my phone. And I turned around, and when I turned around, he ran behind me, and I just barely caught a glimpse of him, and then he got between me and the hemlock forest, and he basically followed me out the entire time. And that's when I mentioned in the interview, he was being very defensive when we were walking back to the camp. Like towards the end, he was starting to do a few wood knocks here and there, and then he would basically start shouting at whatever was in the woods. You could hear him grunting and making growling noises and that, and that's when he let out that huge roar pretty much at the very end of the walk, when it was starting to get really dark. And that's when I thought something must have been watching me in the hemlock forest, and it must have been basically paralleling me on my right side when I was walking in. And then as I started walking out, he was paralleling me on my left side again. Or no, not my left side again. My left side would be walking out, and then he was paralleling me on my right when I was walking in. But the Sasquatch got in between me and him, or whatever it was that was in the woods. And basically he stayed between me and whatever was watching me or stalking me in the hemlocks. And I guess he was keeping the thing at bay and basically letting it know it's like, if you come out, you're going to get hurt. Finally, at the end of the walk, I got into the hardwoods where it cleared up, and the Sasquatch basically stayed back. I didn't see him, and whatever was paralleling me in the hemlocks never followed me up because it was just too open. But basically, in the entire time, he watched over me.
Well, thank goodness he was there and protected you from whatever it was. We don't know for sure what it was, but I'm sure glad he was there to keep it away from you.
Yeah, I'm glad he was there. I mean, like I said in the interview, I mean, I've seen him throughout the years since I was a kid and up until now. Yeah, I think he's more of a guardian than anything. Because I guess, seeing me as a kid, and he's seen me grow up all these years, I guess he hasn't seen me as a threat. He knows I'm not going to shoot him. I mean, if my dad saw him, I bet my dad would probably take a shot at him. But that's just him.
That wouldn't be a wise move.
Yeah, I don't think I'd probably see him again after he did that.
Yeah, you're probably right. A week to the day after you had that experience, you saw a dog man. Please tell us about it. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Well, the encounter pretty much started the weekend prior to muzzleloading, because the season for deer was over, and we decided to do a coyote hunt. And of course, during the entire day, I felt like I was being stalked since probably about 11 or 12 that day. We'd been doing call blasting with an electronic caller. We were doing rabbit cries and a couple coyote howls, yelps. And I think we even tried out, was it a fawn in distress? And of course, the fawn in distress, we actually did get a couple coyote calls that returned basically what we had blasted, but we never saw them. I guess they're just really smart, and they knew that we were hunting them, so they kept their distance from us. And later that day, I heard this howl after I did a coyote yell, and it was not a coyote. It was definitely something else, and it was just the most eerie howl I've ever heard. And surprisingly, my dad and the other guys didn't hear it. And of course, we were all separated from each other basically as a safety precaution. If we'd spread out, get a better chance of seeing the coyote. But it was also to make sure that, nobody would shoot each other. We knew where everybody was, so we knew what our shooting lanes were. And the entire time that we were doing that, I had the call blaster, so I would bring it with me. My dad would basically text me on the phone, say, all right, move here, and then sit here for an hour, and then move here, and then sit there for an hour, and then move there, and sit there for an hour. And basically when I'm sitting there for the hour, do maybe 6 calls total with a certain amount of time between each call. And every single time I'd move, I would hear this howl, and it would just get closer and closer and closer and closer. And finally, at the end of the day, this was before I was in the hemlock forest. But of course, I still couldn't see it because this particular day we'd gotten a lot of snow. The trees were covered in it. You could barely see it. I mean, you got drenched walking through the woods that day because the snow was falling all over you. And I did catch a glimpse of something big and black behind me. It was following my tracks. I could just see a couple bits of movement through the trees, but I mean, the snow literally shrouded everything you could possibly see. You could not see anything. And I just caught a couple glimpses of it moving, and I guess it must have moved off and didn't know where I was, didn't keep following my tracks, and it just left. And of course, that whole entire day was unproductive as far as shooting coyotes. We didn't see any. We went back out and basically followed our steps, our tracks, to see if the coyotes were following us. And of course, there were coyote tracks. My dad actually went back out once we got back to camp because we had to warm up. It was just so cold that day. And he said there was a pair of tracks that were following mine, but he didn't say who made them, and he didn't take any pictures of it, and he also didn't identify them. He just assumed that it was a person. And he said, well, I guess must be Jamie or Wyatt was following you when we were going through the woods there. He said they must have veered off and noticed that they were walking right towards you. So I said, oh, that's kind of weird. I thought they were over to my left. It's like I thought we were all spread out. And he said, I thought we were too. It's like, oh, whatever. Somebody was following me. They're following me. But then I started thinking about it, and I was like, none of those guys were wearing black, and I saw a black figure in the trees. And this is like literally right out in the middle of a hardwoods forest. And there was nothing to basically shadow them. So if it would have been one of them, I would have automatically known what color clothes they were wearing, because both of them had an orange hat on. I would have definitely seen that. And none of them were wearing any black colors. It was just all camouflage and some orange clothing. So it definitely wasn't one of those guys. It was just completely black. So that was that. I didn't see it completely. I just caught the glimpses of it. And of course I heard the howls that day. And we finished that weekend. I thought about what I thought I saw. And of course I remember I messaged you on Facebook about it. And of course I couldn't verify it as a dog man. So I thought, it could have been one. It could have been a Bigfoot. It could have been something else. So I shrugged it off. And then the next weekend we decided, well, we're going to go on another coyote hunt. Now, this is just basically leading up to the events of the big encounter, the one that basically scared the hell out of me. This particular weekend, it was the third weekend prior to all my other encounters. So you basically had the Bigfoot counter the last weekend of rifle, and then you had the encounter, or the so-called encounter of the dog man the second weekend, which was the first weekend we went out hunting coyotes. And then the third weekend. That weekend, we went out again at 9 o'clock, and we did our call blasting. They did the same method again. And it was about noon that after I stopped to eat lunch, I texted Dad. They said, just eat your lunch wherever you are. And it's like we all brought our lunch with us, so we weren't going to worry about getting together. And, of course, the day wasn't god-awfully cold. I mean, it was still in the high 20s. It was a lot colder the prior weekend. It was definitely in the teens. But I stopped to eat my lunch, and I heard this howl again. And, of course, this was really, really close. I mean, it was definitely within so many hundred yards of me, because it literally made the forest itself basically echoed when he howled. And it was bad enough to the point where it was so loud that some of the snow actually had fallen off the branches from the actual vibrations of the howl, basically just echoing through the forest. And I thought it was really creepy. And of course I started thinking, it's like, this is definitely not a coyote. I mean, I've heard coyotes time and time again, and this sounds way too big and too unnatural to be a coyote. So for another hour after, I had just finished my lunch, got back up, and, I did some more call blasting, and I was starting to approach the hemlock forest on the camp lot. So as I was call blasting, each time I would do a call blast, if it was a rabbit or the fawn in distress, I would never hear anything. I heard a couple coyote yelps, and that was about it. But as soon as I would do a coyote yelp, this thing would howl, and I would hear it. So finally, it's like, this is getting really creepy. I don't know what's going on. And this thing was just getting closer and closer. And I kind of shrugged it off. I said, maybe I'll see it. Maybe it's a coyote or a wolf hybrid. So finally I got into the hemlocks, and of course it really creeped me out because I got into the hemlock forest, and it was just really dark in the trees. And I mean, of course, with the sun being out that day, the forest is really eerie because if you look into the forest, the canopy is so thick because of the trees that little beams of light will come through the tops of the trees, but they'll be just completely surrounded by darkness, and you can't see anything else. It's just incredibly hard to see in there. If you do see something, you'll see the shapes. That's about it. So finally, I got into the hemlock forest, and my dad told me to go sit basically where my uncle had shot a spike horn years and years ago on that road. It's like one of those fat green chairs that you would see out in someone's lawn. We put one of those there next to a hemlock tree. So I decided, I'm going to go sit there. Dad wanted me to go. So I went and sat in that chair. I put the collar down, and I did a couple more call blasts. I did some coyote yelps, and it was about 3:22 when this happened, and I could hear something walking through the woods, and it sounded like it was on two legs. Now, of course, the forest where I was, the canopy is just so thick that even when you get a blizzard, the snow barely gets through the trees. It sticks basically to the tops of the trees and barely gets down to the ground. Now, there's still snow down there, but it's just not that thick. It's mostly still the dead branches and leaf litter on the ground. But I could hear it walking through the woods. I could hear it crunching. And of course, I sat there and listened to it and listened to it. It's like, okay, is my dad walking through the woods? Because it sounded like it was on two legs. So this thing is just continually walking through the forest, and it's over top of a little knoll that's in front of me. This is about 75 yards away. And I sat there and listened and listened and listened. Of course, I was starting to get really freaked out because it's like, I don't know if it's my dad. I don't know if it's something else. I don't know if it's one of the other guys. I don't know if they got lost. And I kept hearing it walking. And of course, at this point, I knew it was about to walk over the knoll. It was literally going to be right over the knoll in like the next couple seconds. And it just went dead quiet. And I sat there and I watched and watched and watched, and I couldn't see anything. And it was just so dark, I was, straining my eyes to see. And I turned away to look in another direction real quick. And I looked back, and there's this dark figure coming up over the knoll. And it was walking as stealthily as possible, and it stopped, and I see the shadowy figure, and I started looking at it, I was like, okay, is it a person? And I was looking again at it, and it's like, that can't be a person. This thing is way too big. And I looked at the legs, and of course I was like, what the heck is that? And I looked at the legs again, and it's like they were bent backwards, and I was like, okay, this is definitely not good, and I started thinking, are my eyes playing tricks on me? And of course, at this time that I'm thinking about that, there's a beam of light that was just coming through the trees right in front of where this thing was. And of course, it stood out into the light. And my heart stopped. I mean, I just froze in fear. I could feel the chill go down the back of my neck, and I looked at this thing and I said, I can't believe what I'm seeing. It's like, I've watched enough episodes of Dogman Encounters to know that this thing is a dog man. But of course, when I was looking at it, this thing looked just like the werewolf from Bad Moon. I mean, the exact same identification. It looked just like it. I mean, the one in the movie, the haunches on that particular werewolf were really short, and you couldn't really see it because they just used a practical man in a costume. But this thing obviously had the taller haunches and more pronounced backward bent legs. And I mean, this thing was just the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. And of course, it was this blackish gray color. And I immediately looked up at the face, and I could see this thing was looking directly at me. It was looking in my direction. And I got every single bit of facial feature. It looked exactly like the werewolf in the movie. The same snout, basically the same teeth. The only thing that was different were the ears that were on the werewolf in the movie were a little bit short. These ones were just a tad bit longer. And they were a little bit more set towards the top. Well, not really the top of the head, but like more, I would say they were more straight up ears, like compared to what you see on most dogmen. They weren't on the top of the head like a rabbit, but they weren't released off to the sides like most pictures you see. They're actually almost parallel to each other when they were sitting on top of the head. But like I said, they didn't look like rabbit ears or anything. The eyes were amber. And of course, the neck was not really a thick mane like most people see. There was a mane, but it was really a lot thinner. And of course, the shoulders were fairly thick with fur. The chest was really thick with fur. You could see through the hair a little bit. You could see like the outline of his chest. And he was very muscular. The arms were built basically just like the werewolf in the movie. You could definitely see the claws. He had probably 3-inch claws on his fingers. They were very much more human-like than they were raccoon-like. And his paws and legs were just, I mean, he was built like a bodybuilder. I mean, he probably could have easily torn one of my arms off and just little to no effort. And basically he just stood there for what seemed like an eternity, but it was maybe only 30 seconds. And of course I was sitting in this chair absolutely scared. I mean, I literally couldn't move. I wanted to take my phone out so badly and get a picture of this thing, but it's in my pocket, which is underneath my jacket, and I'm wearing a huge wool jacket. This thing is really warm. I mean, probably that's the reason why I wore it that day. But it's just so thick that, you're wearing all the gloves and that, and just the jacket being overall as thick as it is, it makes movements to get into your pocket like almost impossible without being noticed. And I didn't want to get this thing's attention, but I knew it definitely must have saw me. I mean, I was wearing perfect camouflage. I mean, even a deer probably wouldn't have seen me sitting against that tree. But I know this thing definitely had to have seen me. It was looking directly at me. I mean, it was looking me in the eye. And I mean, I could literally just sense this thing looking at me, and it probably was looking at me like, hey, you look like a potential meal. It's obviously he must have been stalking me during the day. Probably thought I was a coyote. But it's like, I don't know who this imposter is, but he'd probably be good enough to eat. And of course, lucky me, when this thing started walking towards me, I was saved by one of the most unlikely creatures. And it would be a group of grouse, which people call a group of grouse a thunder of grouse, because when a grouse takes off, they sound like a helicopter. I mean, they're literally loud as. That's just one. But when a whole group of them goes off, they literally are so loud that, I mean, if you're in an area with snow, literally the sound itself will just make the snow fall off the branches. It just makes everything rumble around it. He stepped forward just barely out of the light, and he scared these grouse out of this tree, and they just burst out of the tree. I don't know how many there were. There must have been over 6 of them. And they just took off flying through the trees. And when they fly off, they don't care if their wings hit branches. When they fly off, you'll hear their branches, or the branches that they're hitting, basically break off, or they hear the wings flapping and hit a branch, and it's a really weird sound. But they took off, and of course they fly pretty fast, and as soon as they did that, he must have thought, they were potentially good food. And I just looked back from watching where the grouse went, and I could see him take off in the exact same direction as the grouse. And he went off on just 2 legs, and then he looked like he went down to 4, but I'm not sure because he went over top of the knoll again and disappeared. I sat there in disbelief, like, okay, it's like, did I just see what I thought I saw, or was my mind playing tricks on me? And of course I sat there and thought about it. It's like, this couldn't be. So my dad texted me about 5 minutes later and said, all right, come down the road and meet us over at the little meadow. So I got up, and of course when I got up, I was super cautious. I was like, I don't know if this thing is still around, but I'm just going to go ahead and assume he is. So I just walked out as quietly as I could and basically was looking behind me, looking around me, making sure this thing wasn't following me. And then I got out to the field and pretty much almost dropped down and just curled up into a ball and said, I can't believe what I just saw. But my dad was there. I just wanted to tell him so badly, but I knew he was just going to say, you didn't see that. It's like, you didn't see anything. It's like your eyes are playing tricks on you. So I basically went through the rest of the day not saying anything. I was completely quiet. My dad was actually wondering why I was acting so weird, and I didn't tell him about it. And we finally got back to camp that night, and I never said a thing to him or Jamie or Wyatt. And I mean, Jamie actually walked up. He said, you look really white in the face. Like, it's like, did something happen? It's like, no, nothing happened. I'm fine. And of course we said goodbye, and that they took off. I said goodbye to my dad, got into the vehicle, and I took off back for my mom's. And the entire time I was driving back, I just was replaying this thing through my head, trying to think, did I see this, or was I hallucinating? It's like, I don't know what was going on, and I was just in complete denial about it. And I thought, it's like, I can't really tell anybody about this because they're just going to laugh at me. But I started thinking, I was like, I'm going to have to tell Vic at one point or another. And finally I told you about it, and here we are now talking about it. That was bad. I mean, literally my anxiety has just been literally as bad. It's the worst it's ever been since then.
Oh, I bet it has been, and for good reason. When you saw that dog man seem to know you were there that day, did you ever think about calling out to your dad for help?
I was thinking about it, But I mean, I don't think he would have been there on time if anything had happened. I mean, granted, I mean, none of us were armed to tackle something that big. I know if I only had a 20 gauge shotgun on me, a little pump action, because I mean, I was only carrying that and slugs for the coyotes. And of course, I got my pistol from it, but I only had a 9mm on me. It's just a little Glock 26. I think shooting one with a Glock 26 is just gonna severely annoy it. So the last thing I wanted to do was, pop a round off at this guy. So it's either I get up and run, or just let this thing eat me and hope that it tears me apart pretty quick. But I mean, other than that, I mean, holy, that's the most terrified I've ever been in my entire life. I mean, I literally had so many things going through my mind when I saw that.
Well, I'm sure you did, and anyone would have been terrified. After seeing a dogman that looked so similar to that werewolf in Bad Moon, have you sworn off ever watching that movie again?
I see pictures of it once in a while online, and of course when I see it, it reminds me of the movie, and it's like I just have this feeling in the back of my head, just don't watch the movie. It's like if you don't want to be reminded of it, don't watch it. So I try to stay away from watching it. I mean, it used to be one of my favorite movies to watch, but just the memories it brings back when I see it, I would prefer not watching it. And of course, seeing the pictures online kind of bring back memories as well. So if I see them, I try not to look at them.
Well, I can understand that. I've never seen a dogman that looked like that werewolf from that movie, and it still makes the hair on my butt stand up every time I see that werewolf. So I can only imagine what you must go through.
Yeah, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, the fact that it resembled the thing from the movie, and I know how vicious the thing was in the movie. I thought it was exactly what I was seeing. So I thought, well, I'm going to die. So of course that thought was in the back of my mind, and I just waited for my unfortunate end. So, I mean, literally I wasn't even at the point of like tearing up or anything. I was just at the point of, basically just I was going to say, oh, I give up. It's like, I'm not going to try and contend with something that's going to literally overpower me. But the nightmares in that, oh my God, it's like I'll wake up and I'll just be in the worst cold sweats, heart palpitations, pretty much the whole 9 yards. Everything is just going wrong with me.
Speaking of those nightmares, if you don't mind, please tell us about them.
Well, most nightmares that I have of that thing are usually just seeing the flashbacks, seeing this thing walking through the forest towards me. And of course, I had a couple of nightmares. I'm sure people have them all the time. The dream inside of a dream. And one particular dream that I keep having is basically taking me back to when I was a kid, when I was running through the woods. And that's when I make this poor decision of turning around to see what's chasing me. And I turn around to see this thing lunge at me. And I literally get pushed to the ground. And that's when I see the mouth open and the teeth. Just as they're about to clamp down, I wake up. And of course, I'm in my bed. And then when I turn my head to look and this thing's face is right in my face, does the same thing. And then all of a sudden you actually wake up. And then you're looking around your room. You're like, oh my God, what the hell is that? And you're looking around your room to see if there's anything in here. And then you finally realize, okay, I'm actually awake now. It was a dream, but you're still drenched in sweat and your heart is just literally beating out of your chest. So, I mean, it's pretty bad, but it doesn't happen every night, but it does happen, I'd say, once a week. It's kind of started to slow down a little bit more. After the encounter, I mean, they were every night, literally every night. Even if I took a nap, I'd have those dreams.
It's hard to want to go to sleep when you know something like that's waiting on you.
Yeah, it's like I even had this thing after the encounter. I don't know why I did it, but my window, I'm really freaked out about something looking in the window. So I put one of my blankets over the window. And I literally, when it gets dark out at night, I don't go anywhere near it. I don't go anywhere near my window. I don't go near any windows in the house. I stay away from.
Well, after what you've been through, that's totally understandable. Have you done anything to try and help yourself deal with those nightmares?
Usually mostly just traditional methods. I mean, my grandmother decided to make me a dream catcher. And I actually put that above my bed, and it actually helps. I mean, I think they actually do work. And of course, the nightmares really have stopped. I get them once in a while, but this is usually when I'm not sleeping on my bed. It's when I'm sleeping somewhere else. As far as that goes, the anxiety, I got to go see the doctor once in a while. I got basically going to do some counseling in that, but he's also going to have me on meds for the anxiety as well, basically to help calm things down.
Well, I hope the counseling and the meds help. That's rough.
Yeah, I'm definitely hoping so too, because it's like I got enough stuff stacked up on top of that to make the anxiety horrible.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. At his closest point, how close would you say that dog man got to you?
He definitely got within the 50-yard mark of me, I would say. He wasn't god awfully close, but he was close enough to the point where I could see every detail on his body.
When this was all going on, did you have any plans for what you might do if it got any closer, such as if it broke the 50-foot mark, you're going to get up and run or try to climb a tree, anything like that you might have had in mind?
The one thing in particular, because the tree that I was leaning up against was a fairly large hemlock, and I thought, well, if it comes towards me, I should use the tree as a barricade. And basically maybe use the shotgun, go for the eyes, and they were only slugs, so it's like you had to make your shots count. I said basically the only thing would be to either blind it or do something to make it so it can't necessarily just find me and tear me apart. I would have to use whatever tools I had at hand to try and destroy whatever senses it had so I could actually make a getaway. But then I started thinking about it. It's like, well, this thing is probably a lot quicker than me. Its agility is a lot better than me. And it's probably much more experienced than I am, because, I may be a hunter, but this thing's been literally living where I hunt. So, when it kills, it's been doing this for so many years, it's probably really good at it. So I just started thinking about my solutions, about how I was going to get away from this thing. And basically the only one in the back of my mind was telling me was just run. It's like when you're running, use the shotgun if you have to. And then once you're out of ammo, don't reload it, just drop it and take the pistol out. And then if this thing tackles you, use the pistol to basically defend yourself as best as you can. And if that doesn't work, then I guess you're going to be coming out of their bowels the next day. So you had to start thinking quick.
Yeah, I'd say. When you're sitting there in that situation, it's only natural to think about options and what you might do, but the truth of the matter is, you were really limited on options.
Oh, definitely. He was just so close to me that my reactions definitely weren't going to be as quick as his.
I'm just glad it didn't go down that way. Do you know of anyone else besides your mom who's had a dogman encounter in that area?
I've actually never heard of anybody talk about encounters up there. The only closest thing that I have to possibly somebody having a dogman encounter was my uncle came back to camp one day, and I remember he went and sat on my grandfather's property. That's what we call the stone pile. And he said that when he got back to his tree stand, he said just before dark as he was getting out, he said something growled at him. And he said it wasn't a bear. He said definitely was not a bear. Bears do not sound like that. And he's heard bears plenty of times, and he knows that whatever it was unnatural, and it really scared the hell out of him, but something growled at him. And then he said he sat there and waited for it to come out, and it never came out. And then it growled again, a lot louder this time. And of course, he got the idea. He's like, okay, time to get out of here. So he got out of the tree stand, and he said he heard a third growl getting closer. So finally, he's like, I've had enough of this. He got on his four-wheeler, and he bolted out of there. Came back, and of course, he looked like he was a little bit white in the face. And he's not one to scare easily, but whatever it was that growled at him definitely sent some type of primal fear down him, and he just got out of there as quick as he could. But that's the closest thing I heard to maybe a potential encounter with a dogman.
After he told you about that experience that he had, were you ever tempted to share your experience with him?
I was fairly tempted to do it, but I still think that him being my uncle and that, and never having an encounter, I don't think he would have believed me. So I kind of shrugged it off and said, I doubt he'll believe what I tell him. I would tell him he could have even potentially encountered that Bigfoot. But the Bigfoot that I have seen, I know he's not aggressive. He's not known to growl at people. I'm sure he probably would, because I'm sure he's definitely seen my dad before. My dad, he'll have his little hissy fits out in the woods sometimes, and he yells. Like, I've been yelled at out there by my dad out in the woods. And the funny thing is, there's a couple times where, it was like, I don't know if it was the Bigfoot doing his typical defensive attitude, but one day my dad was yelling at me when we were out cutting wood. I can't remember what it was I did. I was starting to get tired, and of course I was just a little guy. but he was starting to yell, and when he did that, something threw a fairly large branch in my dad's direction, and it hit the tire of the tractor. And of course, he thought somebody else threw it, and of course he's looking around like, what the hell? And he starts looking up in the trees to see if it fell. But I clearly saw it being thrown, and of course, I saw it hit the tractor tire, and I was like, what the heck just happened? And of course, I was just a little guy, and I didn't know what happened. So I think, maybe even it might have been the Bigfoot. Maybe he threw the branch at my dad because he was yelling.
Since your dad doesn't believe in the existence of dogmen, what kind of effect has that had on you?
Typically, as far as that goes, I don't really talk to him about anything like that. I mean, I find it hard to talk to him about most anything because he has his viewpoints, I have mine. But the fact that he's never experienced anything out in the woods, I'm pretty sure that the Bigfoot I see probably just overall avoids him when he's out there. Because, I mean, he obviously is probably going to know, well, this guy's probably going to try shooting at me, or he's going to yell at me thinking I'm a guy in a monkey suit. But everything paranormal, like, I can't even play a horror movie at my dad's house. He cannot stand them. He will not watch them. Even if I watch a documentary, I've watched Bigfoot documentaries there before, and he just ridicules them. So I just try to keep it hush-hush from him because he just refuses to believe any of it.
Well, I can understand you doing that. It sure is a shame he's so close-minded, though.
Yeah, I wish he was more open-minded about it, but he decides to keep everything closed-minded, doesn't care about whatever might potentially be out in the woods. I mean, that's the thing that scares me about it, because it's like if he encounters what I saw that day when we were coyote hunting, well, I'm sure he would probably still try and remain closed-minded about it and think it's a guy in a costume, but unfortunately for him, if it did decide to do something, he wouldn't think it's a guy in a costume when it starts to rip him apart.
Then it's too late, though. Would you describe your feelings towards that dogman as being more fearful or angry, considering the effects your encounters had on you?
Definitely more fearful. I know the anxiety, it's particularly at the fault of past experiences why I have anxiety that apart from the dogman. But I'm not really angry at him, just more afraid. Because, I mean, I was actually surprised that the Bigfoot wasn't around that day, but I'm sure because of the territories that are up there, I'm sure he was just not particularly fond of that hemlock forest. Like I've said, I've never seen him in there. I've only seen him out in the hardwoods and other sections of our property. So, I mean, at the same time, I was kind of hoping that he would be there to stop this thing from doing anything. But of course, fate had it that day that I saw this thing and he wasn't around. And basically, ever since then, I've just been fearful of that particular dogman. I don't know where he lives, where he's holding out at the woodlot. I don't know if he's still there. I'm sure he is, with a plentiful supply of deer that there is up there. But that particular area and that particular dogman, I'm just scared to death of him. I don't ever want to go in the same area that he's in, and I don't want to see him again, because basically, seeing him once was enough.
I sure hope you never do see him again.
I hope I don't see him either.
Yeah, I'd say. Do you see a time when you'd be willing to go back into the woods at night alone again? If so, what would it take?
Unless I've got a predator from the movie Predators right there with me to keep an eye out, then I don't trust anything.
Yeah, that would help. Well, Dave, it's about time for us to get out of here, but before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Well, I do gotta say this, I know there's a lot of people that I've seen comments, I've seen people talk about it. It's like, oh, people have seen a dogman. They're like, oh, I really want to see a dogman now. It's like, I kind of thought the same thing when I was listening to the episodes, but after that, you do not want to see one. I mean, literally, when you see one, there's so many thoughts that go through your head about what could happen. And I mean, some of those thoughts that go through your head, like if you watch an American Werewolf in London or other werewolf movies, you start comparing when that thing attacks somebody in the movie and tears them apart. You start thinking about, wow, it's like I might potentially be killed in the same manner. So, I mean, if you really want to see one, I mean, unless you got a tank, I definitely wouldn't recommend going out in the woods and looking for one. So, don't hope that you see one. They are absolutely terrifying. They're definitely to be respected. If you're hunting, don't shoot it. I mean, I've heard enough episodes to know that when people shoot them, it does nothing. And I'm, in particular, was not going to shoot one. Never will. So, I mean, unless it's a last-ditch effort to keep yourself protected, I wouldn't do it. I would just try and stay clear from it. Don't try to antagonize it. If you do see one and it's pretty close to you, I would just say, start thinking about solutions to get out of there. And if you have no other solutions, well, defend yourself. But I don't think anything is going to stop this thing if it wants to get to you.
Very well said, and I couldn't agree more. Yeah, if you want a thrill, go skydiving or something. Don't go out looking for these things. Skydiving is probably going to be a lot safer. Well, thanks again so much for your time and for coming on the show and sharing that experience with us, Dave. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Vic. I'm glad I could actually talk to you about it.
Well, I'm glad you did. Well, have yourself a great night, okay?
You too. Take care.
Thanks. We'll see ya.
Bye.
Bye.